this underlying thought that Paul has in the middle of Galatians 2. For he who worked effectively in Peter for the apostleship to the circumcised also worked effectively in me toward the Gentiles. I want to just keep that on pause. We'll come back. Verse 9. And when James, Kepha, and John, you remember how we always talk about the trilogy, Peter, James, John? Who was in the garden with Jesus? Peter, James, John. Who was at the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus? Peter, James, John. This is Peter, James, John. Kepha, the other word for Peter. James, Kepha, and John, who seem to be pillars, they're pillars of the church, perceived the grace that had been given to me. They gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they should go to the circumcised. Give me one more verse, verse 10. They desired only that we should remember the poor, the very thing I was also eager to do. And so the context here is, I'm defending the gospel. The gospel's been given to me to give to uncircumcised people. The pillars of the church really just wanted to make sure that while I was preaching the gospel to Gentiles, I remembered the poor. Paul said that was easy to do because that was my whole intent anyway. Who do they think that will receive the gospel first? That was what Jesus said. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And whenever Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he hath anointed me, what was the very first thing he was anointed to do? Preach the gospel to the poor. So Paul says, I'm cool. I'm doing exactly what I'm called to do. Now we could leave there and say, talk a little bit about circumcised individuals, uncircumcised individuals. But I don't know how many of you saw the power and the importance of a moment just a couple of verses ago. Go back with me to verse 8. This is where we take our pause for a second. He who worked effectively in Peter for the apostleship to the circumcised also worked effectively in me toward the Gentiles. And the word effectively, he who worked effectively. There's two words there in the English. Work effectively comes from one word in the Greek, and it's the word energeo, E-N-E-R-G-E-O. Don't worry about spelling or pronunciations, but a lot of our English words are derived from their Greek roots. And the word energeo, can you imagine what English word might come out of the Greek word energeo? Energy. So let's substitute the English word energy for he who energized Peter, or put energy in Peter for the apostleship to the circumcised. Also, here's another timeout. Guess what Greek word Paul uses right here for himself? You got it, energeo. To the apostleship to the circumcised also energized me toward the Gentiles. Now all this happens inside of parentheses, so Paul just really wants you to know, hey, timeout, I just want to point something out. The same energy that's in Peter is the same energy that's in me. Peter's energy is to preach the gospel to circumcised people. My energy is to preach the gospel to uncircumcised people. But what did they call that energy? Verse 9. And James, Kepha, John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that had been given to me. In other words, that which they admired in me was the grace of God. Peter had the grace of God to preach to circumcised people. I had the grace of God to preach to uncircumcised people. But what did the grace of God do inside of Peter? Energized him. What did the grace of God do inside of Paul? Energized him. And so Paul is saying God's grace, this is an introduction to grace that grace people need. Not just the idea that grace forgives me of my sins. Grace sets my feet on a solid rock. Grace forgets my past. Grace lays out my future. Everything I just said, I believe with all of my heart. Grace forgives me of my sins. Past, present, future. How do I know grace forgives me of my future sins? You better cross both fingers on both hands and hope, because Jesus died 2,000 years before you were thought of. If grace can't forgive your future sins, you haven't had any of your sins forgiven until Jesus comes and dies for them. Has Jesus already died for your sins? How is it possible that he could die 2,000 years before you committed any of them, and yet they could still be forgiven? Because the power of God's grace is not limited by space and time. God steps into the timeline so that you can see what God would look like if he could live in human form.